Hello, everyone, and welcome to my thoughts on The Last of Us season finale, episode 9, titled Look for the Light. My goodness, you guys, what an episode, yeah? And sorry this review is so late. I've had nothing but technical difficulties on top of an extra busy week, and so everything worked against me getting this out in a timely manner. But here we finally are. And as usual, the first few minutes of this review will be spoiler free, and then later on I will give you a warning before I head into spoiler territory. Wow, how can I even describe this episode without spoilers, huh? I really don't feel like I can say a lot. I will say this was a really well done episode. It's so close to the game. In fact, they kept almost everything that's in the game. They did remove one large action sequence involving some infected and a couple other small things, but they didn't add anything big. Well, except for the flashback at the beginning of the episode, which isn't in the game. But the ending is exactly like how the game ends, which I am so happy about. I was afraid that they would change it and that it wouldn't be as good. But no, they kept true to the game through all of it. And it was such a powerful episode, and sad and conflicting and just horrible and beautiful and terrible. If you haven't seen it yet, prepare for a gut-punching, heart-twisting episode. I think it was the most emotional episode of the entire series. At least for me it was. It hit me in the feels more than any of the others did. There were a couple small things that I didn't like. The main one being that it was so darn short. 42 minutes? This is the shortest episode of the entire season and the finale. Aren't finales supposed to be longer than all the other episodes? And I can even see ways in which they could have made it longer, so that's even worse. But I will talk more about that in the spoiler section. This episode is nearly flawless, and I can't believe it's over now. The season is over. What a ride. And well, that's that's really all I have to say without spoilers, you guys. I want to get into the details now. So if you haven't seen it yet and don't want to be spoiled, save this video for later and then come back after you've watched the episode and tell me what you thought of it. I really would love to hear from you. All right, let's get into the details. So the episode starts with a cold open to a flashback of Ellie's mom, Anna, played by the amazing Ashley Johnson, who played the original Ellie in the game. And this flashback basically sets up the events surrounding Ellie's birth, because Anna is pregnant and in labor, about to give birth to Ellie. And it's a pretty traumatic experience because she's being chased by an infected and she's forced to kill it when it attacks her, all while she's in labor. And she's bitten before she manages to kill it. And then she immediately gives birth after that. It's pretty crazy. Then she hurriedly cuts the umbilical cord in an attempt to prevent the infection from getting to the baby. But it's too late. And enough of the infection or whatever is transferred to the baby. And this is what makes Ellie immune. Her little body somehow builds an immunity to it or something. I don't know the science behind it. Anyway, and then some hours later, Marlene and some Firefly guys find Anna there in the house, holding Ellie in one arm and holding her knife to her own neck with her other hand. She's about to kill herself because she doesn't want to turn. If she turns, she'll kill her own daughter, and, she'd rather die than do that. And she tells Marlene to take Ellie and find her a good home and to give her the knife when she's older. And this is the same knife that Ellie's had throughout the entire series, the Switchblade. And then Anna tells Marlene to kill her because she doesn't want to turn. But Marlene struggles with that because they were best friends since childhood and she can't bring herself to kill her. But Anna begs and pleads, and finally Marlene gives in. And that's the end of the flashback. This whole sequence is so sad and scary and heartbreaking. A strange mix of terror and joy and grief. And as a mother of 3, I can fully imagine the horror of giving birth in that kind of situation. What that poor woman had to go through. But it was wonderfully acted by Ashley Johnson and so poetic in a way as well that the original Ellie is giving birth to the new Ellie. And also just the fact that Ellie was born into such violence. And you can tell that she got a lot of her strength and toughness from her mom. This scene was really well done, and I enjoyed watching it. However, I kind of wish that this flashback wasn't in this episode because it was 10 minutes long. And so that gave us only 32 minutes left in the episode to show what's happening with Joel and Ellie. And 32 minutes was not enough time for the season finale, and it left the episode feeling very rushed. I wouldn't have minded the flashback so much if it had been added onto an already full-length episode about Joel and Ellie. I don't understand why they couldn't have made the episode an hour long or even an hour and 10 minutes long. It's not like they haven't done that before, right? So, yeah, that really disappointed me, and it is the main complaint that I have about this episode and about the series as a whole, actually, but I will talk more about that at the end of this video. Anyway, this flashback is also not in the game, so the game doesn't tell us a lot about Ellie's mom or how she died. We do have a few clues, mainly in the form of a letter that is in Ellie's backpack, which was written by Anna to Ellie less than a day after Ellie was born, and Anna knew she was going to die when she was writing it. There are also bloody fingerprints on the letter, so we can assume that she was injured when she wrote it. But the game never tells us just how she died, and we never learn why Ellie is immune. And then we skip forward, and winter is over. It's spring now, so maybe a month has passed since the last episode, and Joel is all better, and he and Ellie are just getting to Salt Lake City. But things are different now. Ellie is different. She's not as talkative. She's not as inquisitive. She smiles when required to, but her heart isn't in it. Her countenance is heavy, and you can tell she's still dealing with what happened at David's. And I'm assuming that she hasn't told Joel about what happened. And so Joel is pretty much in the dark still, so he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't push her to tell him what's wrong, which is good, but at the same time, he feels helpless and he's worried about her. I do love how Joel is in these scenes. His walls are down now. He has fully given himself over to being a dad again, and he treats Ellie just like his daughter. He jokes with her the same way he joked with Sarah. This is Joel with purpose and a reason to live. He's happy for the first time in 20 years. But in this scene, their roles are reversed now. Joel is the one who talks constantly and tries to be funny to draw Ellie out, and Ellie is the one who is withdrawn into her own trauma. It's definitely a bittersweet time. But I love the attention to detail and how they matched the show to the game in this episode. Most of the time throughout the series, they have the same events or similar events as the game, but they didn't do a lot to make it look the same as the game. They did here and there, like the Capitol building, the museum, Jackson, and Todd's Steakhouse. They are all how they look in the game. But other than that, most of the locations in the show don't look the same as the locations in the game. But in this episode, they really went out of their way to match the game. And I noticed, starting with this scene on the freeway, it looks the same as the game. There's even the same RV where Joel got the Chef Boyardee. Although in the game, there's no Chef Boyardee and there's no guitar. But the RV is there. And Joel does talk about teaching Ellie to play the guitar in this scene in the game too. It's pretty much the same as the game. Although something that they didn't put in the show, in this scene that I wish they did, is a short moment where Ellie sees a picture of an airplane on the side of a bus, and she tells Joel a dream she had.
Yeah.
Go on, tell me about it.
So, I'm on this big plane full of people, and everyone is screaming and yelling because the plane's going down. So I walk to the cockpit, open the door, but there's no pilot. I try to use the controls, but I obviously have no clue how to fly a plane. And right before we crash, I wake up. I've never been on a plane.
This dream is full of symbolism for Ellie's life. Airplanes and dreams often signify our lives. And if we are a passenger in the plane, it signifies our life being out of control, especially if there is no one piloting the plane, as in Ellie's dream. And Ellie tries to pilot the plane, but it still crashes. This dream could signify Ellie's lack of control in her own life. She's been shuffled around from place to place, from person to person, her whole life. She has no control over it at all. And it could also signify her goals being too big for her and an inability to reach those goals, which, is the case as well. And in this case, if they had put this scene in the show, it could have provided a bit of foreshadowing to what happens in the end. Ellie's life is out of control and her goals aren't met in the end. Other people decide for her how her life is going to go. And even when she's given the choice, when Joel tries to talk her out of completing the mission, she insists that they keep at it, that they see it through to the end. But even as she tries to take that control of her own life, she still can't do it. It's still beyond her ability. And the plane crashes despite her best efforts. And even though this is a very simple scene, I've always found it to be very poignant and thought-provoking, and I wish that they had put it in the show, especially considering how short this episode was. It could have used a couple more scenes, and here there was one in the game ready to go, and they took it out. I was really disappointed about that. Anyway, so they get into the city, but they don't know where this hospital is because the road that leads there is blocked by tons of rubble. So they do Joel's tried and true method of going into a skyscraper to get a look at the area and see if there's a different way to go. This is a bit different from the game. In the game, they go into a bus depot just because I guess they use it as a way to get through. I don't know. They don't go up into a skyscraper, but I guess it doesn't really matter what kind of building it is. They have the same scene inside it in the game where Joel needs to boost Ellie up to reach a ladder, but she has checked out and does not hear him. I feel like it means more in the game, though, because in the game, boosting Ellie up to reach something is a regular occurrence, and she is always right there waiting to be boosted up. We get so used to it that it's just the normal thing to do, and it's predictable, and you expect it to go a certain way. But in this moment in the game, you activate the spot for the boost, and Joel gets into position to boost her, but she doesn't come over. And he looks over and sees her sitting in silence by herself, and even when he calls her, she doesn't hear him at first. In the game, this hits you hard because it's a departure from the norm, and you know that everything isn't all right with Ellie. Whereas in the show, it's not a thing that they do regularly. In fact, they do it only one other time in the whole series, and so there isn't that contrast that is there in the game. Not that it didn't work in the show, I just think it works better in the game. I still like it, though, that they put it in there, regardless, because fans of the game will notice it. And of course, once Ellie has been boosted, she sees a sight that distracts her, and she nearly drops the ladder on Joel as she runs off, which happens in the game too. And he runs after her, totally terrified that she's going to run face first into danger, which is a perfectly reasonable assumption, right? But there is no danger. There's a giraffe. And I am so happy they put the giraffe scene in the show. But how could they not, right? It's the most iconic scene in the entire game. They can't possibly leave it out. And I'm so happy that they used a real giraffe and didn't resort to CGI. Because let's face it, it would have been bad CGI. And yeah, this scene was filmed at a zoo with a real giraffe. But this is another moment where they went out of their way to make it look just like the game. And I noticed. And in this moment with the giraffe, Ellie can't help but enjoy herself. For a moment, she forgets her trauma and she can smile again. And in this scene, Joel doesn't even look at the giraffe. He's looking at Ellie the whole time, taking delight in her joy at seeing her come alive again. He can see that she's still in there. The old Ellie that he's come to know and love isn't gone. She'll be all right. Maybe not overnight, but eventually she'll be all right. And then the giraffe walks away, and so Ellie runs off to find a different vantage point to continue watching the animals. And we get to the next iconic moment from the game, where Ellie and Joel lean against the wall and watch the giraffes. And again, they made it look just like the game. And the game gives you full control over the length of this scene. Ellie and Joel will stand here for as long as you want until you push a button to make them stop. And no matter how many times I play this game, I always let them stand there for a couple minutes and just soak it all in. It's a welcome respite between all that horror with David and the inevitable horror to come. And so it is in the show as well. And I really appreciated it. This scene is expanded upon a little bit for the show. Their conversation is a little longer. Joel wants to just forget about their mission. He wants it to be over. He wants to go back to Tommy's and just live happily ever after with Ellie. And he gives her that choice. But she can't. After everything that's happened, after everything she's done, it can't all be for nothing. She needs her life to matter. She needs those deaths to matter. And she wants to see it through to the end. But in the show, she adds that when it's all over, they can go anywhere he wants. Tommy's, a sheep ranch, the moon. She'll follow him anywhere he wants to go. And I love this little addition. It calls back to their conversations of the past and showing Joel that Ellie is with him no matter what. She doesn't care where they go or where they live. She just wants to be with him. And you can tell that that means a lot to him.
I'll follow you anywhere you go.
And after this, they go into an area where there's an old first aid camp sort of thing that was set up by the army right after the outbreak. And this scene is in the game too, directly after the draft scene. And it's a little different from the game. In both versions, this is where Joel opens up about Sarah for the first time. And in both versions, Joel tells Ellie that he ended up in a first aid station like that one right after the outbreak. But in the game, he doesn't say why. And I always assumed it was because he got shot that night when Sarah died, because he did. He was shot too. But the show adds a conversation that isn't in the game that explains why Joel was in the triage unit. And he points to the scar on his head and says it was because of this. And previously, in episode 3, he had told her the story of how he was shot at by a guy who missed. But now he says that he was the guy who shot and missed. And this is something that the game doesn't really talk about, on whether or not Joel had ever attempted or even contemplated suicide. It does give us a hint that he might have. There is a moment when you can find the skeletons of a couple people who had killed themselves. And Ellie will make a comment about them taking the easy way out, and Joel says, "Trust me, it ain't easy." And so you can assume from this that he has personal experience with it. But it doesn't tell us more than that. And this moment is actually entirely missable. And even if you do see it, Ellie and Joel don't talk about it any more than this. The game never elaborates on it or makes it clear that, yes, he did try to kill himself in the past. But I always imagined that he did, because he lost his only reason for living, and it completely wrecked him and changed him as a person, even 20 years later. And now Ellie has filled that hole in his heart and has given him a reason to live again. And there is no doubt in my mind that if Ellie died, Joel would die too, and he wouldn't flinch next time. And so it always made sense that there was at least one moment in his life where he faced that decision. But yeah, the game never tells us much about it, because the game never delves too deep into Joel's psyche. And so I'm really glad that this show did, because those are some of my favorite parts. And it created a really nice moment between Joel and Ellie. Joel opens up to her, admitting to her that he never felt like life was worth living after Sarah died. And he's also trying to show her that even though bad things happen and you feel like there's no hope left, you still have to hold on, because hope could be just around the corner. Happiness could be just around the next bend. And Ellie says,
So time heals all wounds, I guess.
It wasn't time that did it.
and that made me tear up, because he was telling her that she is what healed that wound, that she has given him purpose again, and that he loves her. And that admission from him means a lot to her. Her reaction proves that. She belongs somewhere now. No matter where they go, she belongs with him. And you can see a change in her countenance after this. She perks up and she can smile and laugh again. Joel facing his pain with her has allowed her to face her own pain and to begin moving beyond it. And like I said, the game doesn't have this scene in it. In the game, when they're visiting Tommy, Ellie steals a picture of Sarah and Joel from Maria. And when they're in the first aid camp, she pulls it out and shows it to Joel. And it's the first time that he doesn't shut her down when she tries to get him to talk about his past. And he thanks her for showing it to him. But they don't have any personal connection with each other in this scene. There's no cutscene and not really any conversation between them. And so I really liked the stuff the show added. Neil Druckmann had the most amazing opportunity with this series, an opportunity that not many writers ever get to have, the chance to go back to an old story that's been out there and being consumed by fans for years, and after years of thinking about all the ways he could have done it better, and actually getting that chance to do it better. And I'd say that maybe 90% of the time he did do it better, especially with little scenes like this one. This is probably my most favorite scene in this episode. After the scene, the show diverges from the game a bit because what comes next in the game is a long sequence where Joel and Ellie go into a tunnel that is full of infected, including 2 bloaters. And so you have to fight through them, but you can do most of this section in stealth if you're good at it, which I usually do. And after the infected, you get to a part of the tunnel that has a river running through it. And there's an elaborate action sequence where Joel gets trapped inside a city bus that is being washed downstream. And Ellie tries to rescue him, but drowns in the process. And Joel ends up having to rescue her. And as he's trying to revive her, he's approached by fireflies who knock him out. And he wakes up in the hospital with Marlene there. And I get why they didn't put this scene in the episode. It would have been a logistical nightmare to reproduce for the show with all that water and the bus and everything. However, I do wish that they had done something a little more than they did do for the show. In the show, they're just snuck up on by fireflies who throw a flashbang grenade at them and then knock them out in the confusion. And it happens so fast, and then it's over. It just felt too simple, I guess. And the fact that the episode is so short makes me wish even more that they had just done more. I mean, why not have some infected, huh? We barely had any this whole season. And Joel and Ellie themselves have seen even less than we have. I mean, in the several months that Joel and Ellie have been traveling together, they personally have only fought infected 2 times. That we've seen anyway. But you know the rule, right? If it didn't happen on screen, then it didn't happen at all. And I feel like there just needed to be one last clicker encounter at the end, you know? A nice bookend to the series. Kind of maybe utilize the new clicker mechanics that they made up for the show with the mycelium underground and stuff that they never used again, which I had a feeling they wouldn't, by the way. So that was disappointing to me. It didn't have to be a huge encounter. There didn't have to be a bloater like in the game. But there could have been something, you know? And maybe it could have even been the infected that put them in danger instead of a river. And Ellie gets knocked unconscious, and that's when the fireflies find them. Maybe the fireflies even kill all the clickers for them. I think something should have happened besides fireflies randomly sneaking up on them. That was just disappointing to me. Yeah. What did you guys think of it? Anyway, so like in the game, Joel wakes up in the hospital and Marlene is there. And this scene is nearly the same as in the game. Their dialogue is a tiny bit different, but the gist is the same. Joel wants to know where Ellie is, but Marlene won't let him see her because she's being prepped for surgery. And she tells Joel how the doctor thinks that he can reverse engineer a vaccine from Ellie's brain, to put it simply. But of course that will kill her. And Joel demands they find someone else, but there is no one else. And Marlene orders her guys to take Joel out to the highway and let him go. But of course, Joel can't just let them kill Ellie. She is all he has in the world. She is his only reason for living. They've made that perfectly clear time and time again throughout this entire story, and especially in this episode. And we've already seen what he's capable of when Ellie's life is on the line, right? And so Joel does the only thing he can do. And this sequence with Joel going through the hospital is the most tragic and sad and heartbreaking scene in the whole season, in my opinion. And it's so much more impactful in the show than it is in the game. And I'll tell you why. In the game, this sequence in the hospital is just another combat opportunity, with waves of people trying to kill you, and if you don't kill them, they will kill you. And like I talked about in my review of episode 8, there is that disassociation between Joel as a playable character and Joel in a cutscene. It's actually called ludonarrative dissonance, where a player's actions during gameplay don't match the character's actions during cutscenes. Last episode I talked about how this ludonarrative dissonance happens with Ellie especially, how Ellie during gameplay can kill dozens of people, and yet when she kills her first person in a cutscene, it's like the first time it ever happened. Games tend to not acknowledge the violence that the characters enact when being controlled by the player, because it's not the character doing it, it's the player doing it. And this scene with Joel in the hospital is just like that too. As we've played Joel throughout the game, we've been through countless situations where bad guys are coming at us left and right, and it doesn't matter who they are or what their reasons are. The game wants us to kill them, and so we do, without question. And when Joel goes on his rampage through the hospital, it's just another one of those scenes. We kill the Fireflies because the game wants us to. And we might not even take the time to consider what Joel is actually doing. There really isn't much emotion behind it because it's just more gameplay. But the show brings it home like the game never could, because the show is more like a cutscene. And this sequence was so well done. It doesn't glorify what Joel does. This isn't a hero moment, you guys. Joel is saving Ellie's life, yes, but he is not a hero, and the show doesn't pretend he is. Everything about the sequence is sad and awful. The music that plays throughout the scene isn't snappy action music or even heroic, hopeful music. It's the saddest music we've heard so far in the series. A mourning violin that drones on and on as Joel calmly murders 15 people. It's not even a mad dash to save Ellie. It's not an adrenaline-fueled fight. It's slow, methodical, and calculated. The camera focuses on Joel's feet over and over throughout the scene to emphasize his slow walk through the hospital, taking out one firefly after another. He disassociates and becomes a robot in order to get it done. He doesn't stop to think about the consequences. He doesn't think about what it might do to his soul. All he thinks about is saving Ellie. In that moment, the greater good and the fate of the world isn't even a blip in his mind. Ellie is his whole world. Ellie is all that matters, and all those fireflies are just obstacles in his way. This scene was beautifully shot. It was horrible, but beautiful because it accurately portrayed what was really going on. It didn't glorify it. It didn't try to paint Joel as a hero. He did a terrible thing, and yet you understand why he did it. And it's difficult to blame him, especially if you're a parent. But I did notice something else about it. Joel only killed people who were a threat to either him or to Ellie. All those guys with guns were a threat. Even if they surrendered, he couldn't trust them not to try to stop him anyway after he had turned his back on them. So surrender wasn't an option. And when he walks into the operating room, he doesn't immediately shoot everyone in there because they aren't armed. They aren't a threat. He tells them to unhook Ellie, and if they had just done what he said without resisting, Joel wouldn't have killed any of them. But the doctor has to be a hero, right? And he grabs a scalpel, and in that moment, he becomes a threat. And Joel puts a bullet in him without hesitation. But he doesn't kill the nurses because he knows they aren't going to try to stop him. He kills Marlene because he knows that she'll just come after him to try to get Ellie back. And he's not wrong. She would have. Joel is pragmatic and he's not naive. He does what he has to do in order to protect Ellie's life. Was it the wrong thing to do? Does the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many? The Last of Us isn't the first story to ask these questions, but the beauty of the story is that it doesn't try to answer those questions for you. It leaves it up to you to decide. And some people will despise Joel for being a monster and for sacrificing the future of the world for his own selfish desires. To them, his actions are inexcusable. But for others, His actions are totally justified. What parent wouldn't sacrifice everything for their child? By not answering these questions for you, it begs you to ask them of yourself. What would I do in that situation? Can any of us really know? No one alive on Earth today has ever had to face a decision like that, has ever had to decide between saving the life of their child or saving the whole world. And perhaps it's not even a decision we could ever fathom until we were in that actual moment ourselves. Many people can justify what Joel did in that hospital, but what he does after that is a completely separate argument. After putting Ellie in a car and driving away, Joel does seem to have a moment of regret. Not regret over what he did, necessarily, because he himself says in the second game that given the chance, he would do it all again. So it's not regret for doing it. But I think it could be regret that he had to do it at all. I can imagine him thinking about that conversation with Ellie on the rooftop. If only he'd been able to convince her to give up and go back to Jackson, none of that would have had to happen. And maybe he regrets that too. But then he does the thing that a lot of people think is the worst part. He lies to Ellie. He tells her that the Fireflies have other people who are immune, and they still haven't figured out how to make a cure. In fact, they've given up trying. And in the show, he takes his lie even one step further. He tells her that raiders attacked the hospital and that he barely got her out of there alive. And when she asks him if people were hurt, he says yes, because it's the truth. It's the only part of his story that wasn't a lie, except he was the one who hurt them, not raiders. And they head back to Jackson, but things are different now. There's a tension between them that wasn't there before as they hike through the wilderness. And Joel opens up and tells Ellie all about Sarah, and almost comparing them, but trying not to compare them at the same time. It's kind of a weird conversation, and I can't help but wonder if he's trying to justify his actions to himself, or at least trying to deflect the elephant in the room, because Ellie knows that Joel lied, or at least she suspects it. But I think she knows, even if she doesn't want to admit it at first, because admitting it would be too terrible, right? But as Jackson first comes into view in the valley below, she finally can't stand it anymore, and she outright asks him to swear that everything he said about the Fireflies is true. And he swears. And she says, okay. There is a moment in the scene that was in the game, but not in the show. Joel says, I struggled a long time with surviving, and as he says it, he rubs his thumb over his watch. It's a small thing, but it's a small thing that I always loved in the game, and I definitely missed it in the show. I do think that perhaps it wasn't necessary to put it in the show, though, since we did get that extra scene where he tells Ellie about his struggles with surviving, where in the game he doesn't. So they probably took it out because they thought it would be redundant, and I get that. Anyway, so yet further debate by the fans centers around the fact that Joel lied to Ellie. Some people will say that they can forgive him killing the Fireflies to save Ellie, but they can't forgive his lying to her. Yet, I think we can all understand why he did it. In that scene with Marlene in the parking garage, it's made quite clear. Marlene tells Joel that he can't keep Ellie safe forever. Sooner or later, she will be killed, either torn apart by infected or killed by raiders. Basically saying you might as well give her up now so her death can mean something. But Joel says,
Maybe. But it isn't for you to decide.
Or you. So what would she decide, huh? Because I think she'd want to do what's right.
what would Ellie want? Marlene is pretty sure that Ellie would want to do the right thing, and she knows that Joel knows that too. And the look on his face proves that he knows it. The Fireflies didn't give Ellie a choice, and they were wrong in that, but Joel is not giving her one either. And he knows that if she had been given a choice, she would have chosen to give up her life, and that terrifies him. You can see him waver a little bit when he realizes that Marlene is right about what Ellie would have chosen. But then he looks down at her for a long time, and his resolve comes back. He doesn't want her to ever have that choice, because if she does, then he'll lose her. And losing her is the one thing he cannot do. She has become his purpose, and without her, life isn't worth living anymore. Was it wrong of him to deny her that choice? Was it wrong of him to lie like he does? maybe so. But you have to remember that Joel is not a hero. He is not a good person. And this story has never once tried to pretend that he is. But, regardless of all of that, he is a really great character, and I can't help but love him anyway. And what about Ellie's response to Joel's lie?
Okay.
Okay. Her okay can be interpreted many ways, except one. It could mean that she knows that Joel is lying, but she chooses to believe it because the truth that he would betray her trust like that is too painful. And so she convinces herself of the lie. It could mean that she knows he's lying, but she also understands why, that he wouldn't be able to live without her, and that he did do the only thing he could. And because she loves him, she chooses to let him have that. It could mean that she knows he lied, and now because he refused to tell her the truth, they are done, and she's never going to forgive him for it. The only thing the okay doesn't mean is that she believes him. And even the creators and actors of the game and the show can't agree on which version it is. They all have a different interpretation of it, which I found to be quite interesting, actually. But the one thing they can all agree on is that it's probably a little bit of all of the meanings, all except the one where she believes the lie. And this is where the episode ends, leaving us with these questions, leaving us feeling icky and sad and torn. But leaving us somehow, in my case anyway, strangely satisfied and dissatisfied at the same time. Because it was such a great story, so masterfully written and wonderfully executed, at least most of the time. Which brings me to the part of this video where I would like to talk a little bit more about my least favorite thing about this episode and about the series as a whole. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I did not like how short this episode is, not only because it's the finale, and finales, in my opinion, should be longer than average, but because it made the episode feel rushed, especially since the first 10 minutes of it wasn't even about the main story. And so, like I mentioned before, if you remove the flashback, the episode was only 32 minutes long, and that is not at all enough time to wrap up an entire season and the progression of the main characters and their relationship, which is the entire point of the show. Especially after 2 episodes in a row where we hardly got to see Ellie and Joel interacting at all. I loved all the time we got with them prior to episode 7, building up their relationship. It felt a little fast at times, but I'll come back to that in a minute. It had decent progression though, and by the end of episode 6, they've reached the climax, more or less, of their relationship as surrogate father and daughter. They've fully committed to each other, and Joel especially has taken great strides in letting his walls down, opening his heart and allowing himself to feel and be happy again. He's found purpose again in Ellie, and Ellie has found security and belonging in Joel. It's wonderful, and you just want to see more of it. And we assume that we'll get to see a lot more of it, because at this point, there are still 3 episodes left to explore this new dynamic of theirs. But we don't get more of it. We get Joel nearly dying and being out of commission for 2 whole episodes with barely any interaction between him and Ellie during that time. We did get some, and what we got was great. I loved it. And don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining about the way the story went. This happens in the game too, and I think it's a very important part of the story. I wouldn't want them to do it any differently. What I am complaining about, though, is what comes after. Or rather, what doesn't come after. End of episode 8, Joel finally is on his feet again, interacting with Ellie. Then episode 9 starts, and we don't even get to see them again until 10 minutes in, because we have to watch Ellie being born first. And again, I'm not complaining about the scene itself. I loved that flashback. I'm complaining about the lack of time we got with Joel and Ellie in the final episode of the season. Only 14 minutes of Joel and Ellie being together the way we've been eagerly awaiting them to be, fully open and comfortable and just father and daughter. 14 minutes before it all goes downhill and it will never be the same again. I don't know about you guys, but I didn't watch 9 whole episodes just to get 14 minutes of the thing I wanted to see the most. This series is about Joel and Ellie's relationship. It is literally the plot of this story. And I just felt like at the end, they rushed through it and it was over suddenly. And that really is the main issue I have with this series as a whole. Again, I absolutely love what we got, but still feel like there's something missing. There weren't enough episodes in the series, maybe. Maybe it needed to be 12 episodes long. But if they wanted to keep it at 9, then I think they should have prioritized Joel and Ellie's relationship over the other stories that used up a lot of the screen time. For instance, the 2 flashback episodes and the stuff with Kathleen's people and the flashback with Ellie's mom. As great as those stories were, they did use up a lot of time that, in my opinion, should have been spent on the main point of the show. And it just so happens that each flashback episode takes place in the worst possible points in the series to deviate from the main character dynamic. Let me explain. The first one being the Bill and Frank episode. And I think that this flashback came at the worst possible moment for Joel and Ellie's budding relationship. The previous episode left us with the death of Tess and Joel and Ellie not really on good terms yet. We needed to see what happens after that. We needed to see how they deal with that loss and with each other, and we needed to see some growth in their relationship. Not to mention that we as viewers hadn't really had a lot of time to connect with them and get to know them as characters yet, especially Ellie, who had not grown on me yet by the beginning of episode 3. What we did not need directly after that was a 45-minute detour about other people who don't even interact with Joel and Ellie at all. Again, I'm not saying that it wasn't a good story that didn't deserve to be told. I'm just saying that it was a sideshow and I paid to see the main act. Yeah? And you may argue that Joel and Ellie did get 30 whole minutes of screen time in episode 3. And yes, they did. But what did they do in those 30 minutes? They walked a lot, and they looted Bill's house. Not exactly groundbreaking stuff. I loved watching it, don't get me wrong. I love everything about Joel and Ellie, but it lacked conflict. And I'm not talking about characters not getting along with each other, or not that kind of conflict. I'm talking about inner conflict, the stuff that makes the characters interesting. It was completely absent from the Joel and Ellie scenes in episode 3 because they weren't really doing anything. The Joel and Ellie scenes felt more like filler in that episode, sort of like token scenes to transition into the story that they really wanted to tell. And you should never, ever relegate your main story and your main characters and their conflict to token scenes. It grinds the pacing to an absolute halt. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't have put Bill and Frank in the show either. Of course they should. Bill is in the game. He's an important part of that story. But if they had kept the flashback shorter, like 10 or 15 minutes to establish Bill and Frank's relationship, then have the entire rest of the time spent with Joel and Ellie there interacting with them, I think it would have been a much more solid and grounded episode, keeping more true to the game while also giving us the much needed screen time and conflict for the main characters. Because in the game, Bill provides some excellent conflict and dynamic with Ellie and Joel that serves to progress Ellie's and Joel's relationship in a natural and believable way. And then we could have gone into episode 4 with a believable advancement of their relationship, rather than the sudden leap forward that we actually got, which didn't feel earned. Okay, and then the second flashback, the one with Riley, also comes at the worst possible time. In episode 6, Joel finally comes to terms with stuff and opens up to Ellie. It's the moment we've all been waiting for, right? And we get a precious few scenes after that before tragedy strikes and Joel is out for the count. Unfortunately, that count lasts a bit too long in my opinion. I'm not complaining about the quality of the flashback. As I said in my review of episode 7, I think it was a flawless adaptation of the game's DLC. I really enjoyed it. And I think of all the flashbacks that we got, is probably the one that feels the most relevant to the main story and the character of Ellie especially. But it did take us away from the Joel and Ellie dynamic for an entire episode, during a time when we really wanted to see what was happening with our main characters. The game did not do this to us, since the Left Behind story was separate from the main game. It was a DLC that you could play after you finished the main game. So in the game, after Joel is impaled, it goes directly into the part of the story with David. And I think the pacing works a lot better in the game because of that. Again, the flashback ground the pacing to a halt. And then the final flashback, which isn't very long, granted, but when an episode is only 42 minutes long and 10 minutes of it isn't about the main characters, it feels like a lot. And especially when the flashback was completely unnecessary to the story. And again, it happens in the worst possible place. The end of the previous episode had Joel and Ellie finally reuniting after being apart through horrifying circumstances. And the very next thing we see in the next episode is not them dealing with that. What? And not only that, but it skips ahead at least a month or more. Granted, so did the game, but the show has already proven that it can successfully deviate from the game and add scenes to flesh out the story more, and I think that they should have done that here. I would have loved to have seen what happens directly after they flee David's. I mean, Joel is still not doing so great. He's got a lot of healing left to do, and Ellie is completely broken. It would have been amazing to see the direct aftermath of that. And then do a time skip, showing the season passing, maybe through a montage of them traveling until they get to Salt Lake City. That's just one way they could have given us more Joel and Ellie dynamic. They wouldn't have had to do it that way. I'm sure that there are other ways too. And remember a few minutes ago when I said I felt like Ellie and Joel's relationship progression felt a bit rushed at times? I really think it's because that they didn't actually have 9 episodes to flesh it out. They only had 6, because 3 of them were mostly not about Joel and Ellie. And the points at which I feel their relationship took the biggest leaps forward without being earned was directly after the flashbacks, as if the show had to make up for lost time or something. My point being that I think the flashback episodes did a disservice to the series as a whole because they took valuable time away from the main characters, the main story, and the main conflict, which ended up not having enough screen time as a result. And I think that is why the pacing suffers throughout the season. And that has been one of the main complaints that people have had about the show. Some people say the pacing suffers because of a lack of action scenes, and I can understand that. I think it's partly true. I think there could have been a few more action scenes than we got, but I don't think it's the main issue. I think the main issue is the constant bouncing around to different storylines that ultimately don't matter. If you take out every single flashback story, it won't affect the main story in the least. The main story would progress just fine without them, and you would never feel like something was missing. And that says a lot. And just so you know, I'm not talking about the first 2 flashbacks that take place before the outbreak. I think they needed to be there to help set up the lore. And they were in episodes that were long enough to contain them and still have enough time left over for the main story. I'm not opposed to the flashbacks being in the show. I think they're all great. I'm opposed to the flashbacks taking precedence over the main story and not giving the main story enough room to breathe. I think maybe what they were doing with these flashbacks was to set a precedent for the series, since the second game has a lot of flashbacks in it. And maybe they wanted to establish that for the show so that season 1 and 2 would have the same format. I don't know. It's just a guess. So in conclusion, the series either should not have had those 3 flashbacks, or else it should have had 2 or 3 extra episodes, because I think Joel and Ellie deserve it. Their story is one of my favorites of all time in any medium, and while I do think the show did an amazing job telling their story, I think it needed just a bit more time to do it full justice. And there are a lot of scenes of the game that they didn't put in the show that, had they been included, could have fleshed it out so much better. Anyway, I hope you all didn't mind that exceedingly long ramble. But since this is my last review video for the series, I wanted to put that out there since it has been in the back of my mind since episode 3. What a ride, you guys. Despite its flaws, this series was amazing. For me, it did have a bit of a shaky start, with me not being so sure about Bella Ramsey as Ellie or the changes they made to Joel's character. But Bella Ramsey quickly grew on me, and now I can't imagine anyone else in the role of Ellie. And the changes to Joel's character ended up being my favorite part of this series, actually. I think it just fleshed him out more and made him more human and more relatable, and Pedro Pascal did the best job that anybody could ever do with Joel. I absolutely loved his Joel. There were some other flaws, but I think they can't overshadow the amazing accomplishment that this series is. It will definitely go down in history as one of my favorite shows of all time. Anyway, you guys, that's the end of my review. I really enjoyed making these videos, and I hope you guys enjoyed them as well. I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. What did you love and not love about this episode, and on the series as a whole? And what is your opinion about the controversial decisions that Joel made in this episode? What do you think you would have done in that situation? Are you Team Joel? Let's discuss it down below, but let's keep it civil, yeah? Let's not let The Last of Us bring out the worst in us. I hope you all stick around on the channel for all my future content, my Fallout 4 roleplay coming soon, and maybe some Fallout 4 TV show reviews, as that series might be coming out sometime this year too, and I look forward to that. I hope you all have a good day, and until next time, remember to play safe, play nice, and have fun.